want to give you the warmest welcome to everyone, special guests, panel members, and participants to this workshop entitled Exchange of Experiences on Methodologies for the Definition of the Cost of a Healthy Diet in Latin America and the Caribbean. Around this event, we want to acknowledge and especially thank the collaboration of some key stakeholders in the region of Latin America and the Caribbean to put on the table the different methodologies that are developed to define the cost of a healthy diet, such as the Institute of Public Health of Mexico, the University of Tufts, the University of the Republic of Uruguay, and the World Food Program that have joined us today. The cost of a healthy diet is explained by a number of internal and external elements to the agricultural and food systems that include or that have a direct impact over the final prices to the consumers. Among this, we find the cost structure of production, the import levels, the logistics, distribution, marketing, advertisement, among many other aspects regarding the value chain like taxes, competition, among others. The FAO is focused on responding and facilitating access to healthy diets and also transforming agricultural and food systems to guarantee that healthy diets are affordable and of easy access to everyone at a reasonable cost so that everyone is able to lead a healthy diet. In order to do that, the FAO has promoted an approach that is based on affording a healthy diet as a set of a number of activities that will make a contribution towards achieving one of the goals of the FAO within its strategic framework 2022-2031 for better nutrition. For those of you that require simultaneous translation, you will be able to access the English, Spanish, English translation on Zoom to choose your preferred language. And for those of you that are joining us from the online broadcasting, feel free to switch languages on the website in the upper right hand side so that if you want to follow in Spanish, please feel free to follow the account FAO Americas and FAO Caribbean. This online activity will take 1 hour and 30 minutes, in which we are going to have interventions from different panel members with a broad experience in this topic. Since we have limited time, I'd like to kindly request all the panel members to please respect the allotted time for your presentations, and I will give you a reminder 1 minute before your time is up. Without further ado, we want to welcome Lynn Duffy, who is the Director of the Food and Nutrition Division for the FAO in Rome. Lynette, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias muy buenos días, tardes a todos.
Thank you, and good morning and good afternoon,
Saludos desde
everyone.
Roma, donde
Greetings from
estamos, de hecho,
Rome.
en ese momento terminando
We are
la
at the
clausura
moment
del
closing
stock take del Food
the
System
stock
Summit.
take of the Food Systems
Y
Summit,
realmente les quiero
and
resaltar la
I would
importancia de
like
la
to
información,
highlight the importance of the
la relevancia de los
information,
datos
the
de
importance of
costo y
data
adquisibilidad
on
de los
cost and
alimentos
affordability and
en los
accessibility of
diversos
foods, and
discursos
how
de los
this
países y los
is
actores
coming up in
que
the
se
different
han
discourses of the
presentado en
different
estos
countries and the stakeholders that
3
have been
días. Y
presenting
realmente
for the last
esa
3 days.
información ha
Actually, all
sido
that
significante
information
en
has
muchas
been
de las
key
narrativas
for many of the
y
narratives,
realmente nos
and
identifica
actually, it
una
identifies
oportunidad muy
us or
importante
for us a huge
de
opportunity
resaltar los
to
problemas que se
highlight
enfrentan los
the
países
issues
para
that the
que la
different
gente
countries are
pueda
facing
consumir una
for
dieta
people to
saludable.
actually consume a
Y
healthy
ofreciendo
diet.
una enorme
And it also
oportunidad
highlights a
para
huge
explorar
opportunity for us
usos
to further
potenciales
explore
de los
potential
datos
uses
sobre el
of
costo y
data
accesibilidad
regarding the cost,
de los
access,
alimentos.
affordability of
En ese
foods.
sentido, yo creo que todos ustedes saben que la
In
metodología
that sense,
se desarrolló
you all
con
know
el
that the
objetivo
methodology
de
was
monitoreo
developed
global,
with the objective of
con
conducting global
una
monitoring
metodología adaptada
with the
al
methodology
país,
that was
pero
adapted to the country,
ampliamente
but
comparable entre
it
contextos. Y eso
was
es
broadly
y es
comparable
justamente
between
lo que
different
se permitió
contexts, which is
elevar
key, and it
la
was what allowed us to expand the numbers to the event that we've been hearing today in Rome for the last 3 days.
Sabemos que si queremos cambiar el costo de la
But we
accesibilidad
know
de los
that if we
alimentos,
want to
esa
change the cost
información
and affordability and
tiene
access to
que
foods, that is
contextualizarse
information that
no
needs to be
solo a
put in a
nivel
certain
del país,
context,
pero a
not
nivel de
only at the country level,
distribución
but
y
also
a
at the
un
sub-regional
nivel de
level and
granularidad
at a
que
level
puede
of
variar mucho
granularity that
sobre el uso
is
independiente
variable depending
de la
on
intención del uso de
the
la información.
intention of the
Y
use
en
of the
ese sentido,
information.
es
And in
muy
that sense,
importante
it's very
que
important
consideramos
that
los
we
programas
consider
la
and we
posibilidad
explore
de
the
evolución
possibility
en
of
las metodologías que
evolving
estamos usando
in the
y
methodologies that we are
reflexionar
using
sobre el
and
acuerdo y
reflecting on the agreement
entre
and
el objetivo del
the
uso de la
match
información
between the
y la
objective of the
metodología
use of information and the methodology
para generar
to
estos datos.
generate data.
Hay muchas cosas que podemos estar usando, haciendo
There are many
con
things
esa
that we could be
información.
doing with that
Es,
information.
uno de los ejemplos es, tenemos mucho
And one of the
interés en
examples
apoyar a
is
los
that
gobiernos
in
al
FAO, we're very
considerar si
interested
los
in supporting the
subsidios a la
governments
agricultura
for
y
them to consider
alimentación
whether the subsidies
estén
to agriculture and food
favoreciendo
are
el costo
actually
y la afordabilidad
favoring
de
a
los
cost and
alimentos en el
affordability
país.
of the foods in
Y
the
es
country.
justamente una oportunidad de reflexionar
And it
sobre,
is
aquí nos dicen
precisely
los,
an opportunity to
voy a hablar al
reflect
inglés, que no
on,
sé cómo se dicen en
I'm sorry, I'll
español,
switch to
food
English.
territory guidelines, perdón, que se me
I'm so sorry, the food
pronuncia.
territory guidelines, I'm sorry.
Pero es una enorme oportunidad
And
de
it's a
reflexionar.
huge
Estas son
opportunity
las
to
guías,
reflect
los
on this.
lineamientos de lo
These
que
are the
queremos que se consuma
guidelines
la
of what
población.
we want
¿Y
population to
cómo podemos
consume
usar esta
and
información
how to use that
ajustando a
information
consideraciones
adjusted
subregionales,
to
en donde sabemos que
sub-regional
la población no
considerations
necesariamente
where we
consume lo
know that
mismo
the
en el norte, en
population
el
does
sur del
not
país o en
necessarily
la
eat the same
montaña y en la
in the
costa.
north or
Es
in the
una
south
enorme
of the
oportunidad
country
de
or in the
reflexionar
mountains or
sobre
near the
nuestra
coastline. It's a
metodología
huge opportunity to reflect on our
y
methodology
encontrar
and
oportunidades de expandirla
it's an opportunity to
para que
find
sea utilizado para
opportunities to expand
informar las
this,
acciones que se
to use this
necesitan
to inform the
para
actions that are
facilitar
needed to facilitate and
y lograr que
to
la gente
achieve
tiene
that
acceso
people
a problemas de
actually have
alimentación
access to a
ajustado a la
healthy and
región
affordable
y el
diet
contexto y las
adjusted to
tradiciones
the region, the context, the
en su
traditions
ámbito.
that they live
Entonces,
in their own
estoy
context.
muy
So I am
complacida de estar
I'm
aquí
very
con
pleased
ustedes
to be here with
y
you
a escuchar
and
las
I'm
diferentes
pleased to
metodologías
hear
que
the
se han
different
estado utilizando en
methodologies that
diferentes
have
contextos
been used in
y
different
les espero
contexts.
un
And
discusión
I wish
fructífera
you a very
para
fruitful
llegar a una
discussion
agenda
in order to reach
acción
an
y de
agenda of
estudio
action and
desarrollo de
studies and
metodologías
development of the
en esa área.
methodologies
Muchas
in
gracias.
that area. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a ti, Linet, por darnos esta
Thank you,
información
Lynette,
y
for
reconociendo la
offering
utilidad y oportunidad que
this
contiene
because it also
el tener
reinforces the
buena
need
nutrición
and the
comunitaria.
opportunity to promote
A
a better
continuación, paso la
nutrition as
palabra
part of
a
the
Maya
strategic
Tacalle,
framework of
líder
FAO. And
regional de la
now, Maya
Organización
Takai,
Mundial
leader of
sobre
the
la
regular
Responsabilidad
program
para la
of
Alimentación y la
the
Agricultura
UN
Sustentables.
for
Adelante,
Food and
Maya.
Agriculture. Maya, the floor is yours. Thank you, Israel. Good morning and good afternoon, good evening, everyone that is in the session. Also, on behalf of the Regional Office of the FAO, I want to thank everyone and welcome you. I want to thank the presence of the Director Lynette. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to the panel members and thank you to everyone. I just wanted to reinforce a couple of things that were mentioned already by the director from the perspective of the region, right? Which concerns us and highlights the importance of the issue of the cost of a healthy diet, which is basically what we know that from 2014 on, 2015 on, the situation of food insecurity in the region is something that has been growing in severity. And of course, from 2019, with the COVID pandemic and also with the effect of the war and the prices of foods, uh, the number of people affected by food insecurity doubled in the region, which is a very severe and it is the highest level from 2006 in terms of malnutrition in the region. So, on top of that, from the moment the FAO started measuring what we call the cost of a healthy diet at the world level, the latest data of 2020, we continue to have the highest average cost in the region, which is of $3.39 per day, in comparison to the average, which is of 3.54. And there are, of course, differences based in the countries and the subregions, but the subregion that has increased this average is the Caribbean with a cost of $4.93 per day, which is a region that highly relies on the imports of foods. This means that in the Caribbean, 4 out of 10 people do not manage, in average, of course, do not manage to access a healthy diet. And in the region, 22% of people are unable to afford a healthy diet. This, of course, is one of the key factors that contributes towards having food insecurity and also the issue of the growth of overweight and obesity that we see as something that is growing in the region, in the world, but more specifically in the region based on the latest data that show that. And we know that there is a close link between obesity and food, with the excessive consumption of unhealthy foods with high levels of sugar, fats, and sodium as well. And that link with the risk of development non-transmissible chronic diseases, which also increases the cost to our health systems. So there is also an economic factor linked to an unhealthy diet, and it's something that we have to pay attention to. It's important to mention that our regional flagship, in reference to the global landscape on food security, as opposed to the regional landscape on food security for 2022 that we developed here in the region, showed the cost of access to healthy foods, and it talked about the challenges and also gave recommendations to address this issue. And of course, addressing the differences in terms of each country, each territory, each region, sub-region, depending or based on the cost. This indicator of cost is based, as it was mentioned already, based on healthy foods of lower cost that are available in time and in the moment of measurement, fulfilling the requirements that are specified in the dietary guidelines of the countries. So, in this work, we address the measures and the countries in the region are putting in place to favor farmers and consumers to help them face a global crisis that is also linked to greater difficulty to access healthy foods. And some of those that were mentioned, for instance, were reducing the taxes to decrease the costs of food imports, subsidies to specific foods from the basic food basket, pricing or price fixing, and also direct subsidies on materials to produce foods, and also other mechanisms to guarantee the right to healthy foods to a larger set of people in the region. So, this webinar is happening within the framework of a regional project to conduct a study on nutritional foods and the cost of a healthy diet, with the objective of monitoring access to nutritional foods that are part of a healthy diet at the local level in the countries of the region. The idea would be to analyze the behavior of the prices of the foods based on the food guidelines mentioned by our director, and also national prices considering that 13 of the foods are key in order to access a healthy diet. This measurement and monitoring of the cost and affordability of healthy diets is of great importance to facilitate looking for regulatory, political actions, plans, and programs to improve this access and to guarantee food security to all the families, especially to those that are more vulnerable, strengthening that the work of FAO strengthening the work of FAO to improve their tools and methodologies, and to draft recommendations to improve price transparency of nutritional foods and also affordability of a healthy diet. With that, I'd like to wish you a very good webinar. I think it's very important for this project that we have mentioned for the region, and we would love to continue expanding our knowledge and working with our partners in the academia, the civil society, and the governments so that all together we're able to improve our incidence over this issue, moving along to fulfill the SDG number two. Thank you. Thank you, Maya, and thank you so much for putting the topic of the epidemiological situation that Latin Americans facing in relation to obesity and other illnesses with the cost and affordability of healthy diets. Before we move on to the next discussion, we are going to be presenting a video related to the UN report where it warns that Latin America and the Caribbean pay the highest price to access a healthy diet in comparison to the other regions of the world. Let's go with the video.
Desde el 2014, el hambre y la inseguridad alimentaria.
Since 2024, hunger and food insecurity have increased in Latin America and the Caribbean to go over the world average. The number of people suffering hunger grew from grew to 56 million people between 2016 and 21, with an increase of 30%. Also, 40.6% of the population faced food insecurity moderately or severely, which means that they had no continuous access to foods or had at least one day where they had no access to food at all. At the same time, 1 in 4 adults suffers obesity, 3.9 million children of up to 5 suffer overweight. This shows a structural issue that has been worsened by a number of prices that have increased the prices of foods and fertilizers, damaging affordability of healthy diets. With that, it is required to transform the agro-food systems to make them more efficient, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. According to the situation of the nutritional landscape of Latin America and the Caribbean in 2022, over 100 million people are unable to access a healthy diet. The region has a higher cost in comparison to the rest of the world, with a value of $3.89 a day, while the world average is of $3.54 a day. The policies to support food and agriculture are a priority to guarantee physical and financial access to nutritional foods and to respond to the needs of farmers, of the trade of foods, and consumers as well. It is required to put in place policies to improve availability and affordability of nutritional foods for the most vulnerable population, women that suffer more food insecurity than men, and low-income families that spend a higher rate of their salaries in foods. The landscape of food and nutritional security of Latin America and the Caribbean 2022, drafted by 5 agencies of the UN, proposes policies to help affordability and access to healthy nutrition to prevent hunger and malnutrition, to support smaller farmers, to diversify the production of nutritional foods, and their engagement with the public procurement systems, also actions to facilitate
the trade in markets, including exchange of information, monitoring of prices, and using digital platforms. Measures to strengthen systems of social protection that are nutritional sensitive, like the school food programs, including suitable menus and community participation to promote healthy diets through laws on labeling of foods and fiscal policies to decrease the consumption of highly processed foods. To eradicate hunger and malnutrition in all its forms will be possible with the participation of all the stakeholders of the entire system. Together, we can guarantee access to the right food for everyone without leaving anyone behind.
Ahora sí, pasamos a compartir.
Okay, now we will start talking about the exchange of experience for methodologies for the definition of the cost of a healthy meal um, system in Latin America and the Caribbean. We will have Daniela Godoy, who is the main officer for food security and nutrition of the FAO, Professor William Masters from Brinkman School and Nutrition and Department of Economics,
Acompañan
from
Saskia de
Tufts University, Saskia Depiv, the global person in charge for the division of nutrition in the global nutrition system from Rome. Carla Mejia, she also works in the global system for food. Michelle Unab Mejia, she works in child and mother nutrition in the INSP from Mexico. Gabriela Fajardo from the Nutrition School and the Department of Nutrition and the Observatory for the University of Uruguay. So we will start with this exchange of experiences with Daniela Godoy from FAO, and she will give us the context and the background for the cost that a healthy lifestyle nutrition has in Latin America and the Caribbean. So go ahead, Daniela, you have 15 minutes. Thank you very much, especially to Israel and our leader for the program, Maya Takado, and all of you who are here from Rome, Maya Takahi as well. Thank you very much for being here. So I will be talking about the food and nutrition situation for food security in Latin America and the Caribbean. What I think that it is important to say before starting to talk about the trends and the information, I would like to talk about some information associated to the global overview, the overview of the region for 2023. But it is important to highlight that this information has been published by FAO as recent, and they are also included in this presentation from the SOFI at a global level, which is our publication from the FAO. So some concepts that are relevant to consider to talk about the cost and the accessibility to healthy nutrition. These things are related to hunger, under feeding, and malnutrition. So as we know, hunger is related to calorie consumption, the energy consumption that is necessary for functioning, for a person to be able to do what they need to do. And also food insecurity is the lack of accessibility, physical and economic accessibility, and also social to food, not just in amount, but also in terms of quality. So that is why it's so important to consider this aspect when we talk about healthy diet, because a healthy diet is different from other types of diet. For example, a diet that it is enough in terms of calories. There are other concepts to consider as well. And this is when we talk about a healthy diet. Here, I would like to highlight that a healthy diet as a concept in terms of the measurement of the cost includes the different foods from different categories. So fruits, vegetables, basic foods, animal origin food, oils, and fats. It is important to consider this as a healthy diet that is associated to the cost of a healthy diet. So when we talk about the cost of a healthy diet, which is included in the publication of the SOFI and also in the overview for nutrition for Latin America and the Caribbean, we're talking about a methodology that includes the prices of all of the different foods and groups that are necessary in a healthy lifestyle. But these were obtained with information of global an annual price and the PCI of the World Bank. So having these prices of foods from different groups, as I already mentioned, we select those that have the lower cost, and then we calculate a cost for each one of the groups. So these costs are going to be added to get the total amount for a healthy diet by person. So as the prices are in the local currency, they are transformed into dollars. So we use the PPC for this transformation so that we're able to compare between the countries. Then once we consider the cost of a healthy diet, then we can define accessibility to a healthy diet as an indicator. So this happens after when we compare the prices, we see the income of the prices using the platform of poverty and wellness and wealth from the global bank. So this diet is not accessible when it is over the 52% of the income of a family. So that is what we need to consider first before seeing the total overview of the region. So considering this, it is important to say something that it was already mentioned before of a series of factors that are going to have an influence in the prevalence of hunger and also food insecurity and malnutrition in all its ways. This has important effects in the cost of a healthy diet, climate crisis, the lack of access to a healthy lifestyle, and also the growth of a country that is going to make more difficult for people to access the level of poverty and inequality and other aspects. For example, the war in Ukraine, we know that this has produced an effect in the increase of the prices of foods and fertilizers as well. So in that sense, it is important to say that the prevalence of hunger in the last time has been increasing, and we have been seeing an increase from the year 2014. But we need to say that between the years 2021 and 2022, according to the information that was recently published by FAO and other UN agencies published by the SOFI, we see that there is a reduction, a slight reduction, but it is important to keep on working so that we can get the SDG 2. We can see this especially in Latin America, where we go from 7% to a 6.5%. However, we need to say that the trends that were presented and the information that was presented still allow us to conclude that these levels are not yet in the levels that we had previous to the pandemic. So this has had important effects in the prevalence of hunger and food insecurity. That shows how important it is to keep on moving forward so that we can go back to these levels and then accelerate to the compliance of the SDG number 2. About prevalence of food insecurity that is moderate or severe, we can also see that there is a trend of reduction, especially in Latin America. In Latin America and the Caribbean, the prevalence was reduced between 2021 and 2022 from a 40.3% to a 35.7%. However, we need to say that the reduction was presented in Latin America, but not in the Caribbean. In the second place, this figure is still over the estimation, the global estimation, as we were seeing before as a trend. And it is also important to say that we still have countries and territories where food insecurity, especially serious insecurity, is still present and it's still affecting many people. So this is something that we need to to address, to be able to implement public policies. Here we can see the comparison according to the latest information that was published between amongst the different regions, and we can see the trend that exists for Latin America and the Caribbean, which is a little bit similar to what also happened in Asia, where we can also see some reductions, but that are not of the level that Latin America and the Caribbean had between 2021 and 2022. Another important topic is how we can see a gender inequality in terms of food insecurity, because it is women the ones that have higher prevalence of food insecurity than men, and that affects mainly rural areas. So that shows us that it is important to differentiate public policies to be able to focus on those groups that are more affected. There are other indicators as well that are related to the cost of a healthy diet and also how accessible it is. And these are the nutritional factors. And this in terms of the delay of growth of children younger than 5 years old, we have seen certain improvement here. We can see that between 2012 and 2022, there's a reduction. There was this reduction in a slower way in the context of the pandemics, but we can see that this delay is still true in certain territories, mainly isolated places in Latin America and the Caribbean. We need to focus on that because these territories are affected by
Una parte este tipo de malnutrición por déficit y malnutrición por exceso, como vendría siendo la prevalencia del
by
sobrepeso.
deficit and also by excess. So obesity in that case. In the prevalence of overweight, considering the latest information that we have seen in 2022, Latin America and the Caribbean is still the region that presents the more prevalence of overweight in children that are younger than 5 years old. And we have been seeing an increase of that, getting to an 8.6% in the year 2022 and affecting 4.2 million children younger than 5 years old. There's something important that we need to address, which is obesity in adults. According to the latest estimation that we have had, is also increasing. One out of four people is affected in Latin America and the Caribbean. Another important aspect to consider is that, as we already mentioned in the initial words, the latest information that is available for the estimation of a healthy diet for 2021 is still showing that Latin America and the Caribbean have the cost of a healthy diet that is the higher one in comparison, in a global comparison. And we can say that this gets to $4.08 per day for year 2021. So we can see that there are also important divisions by region, and the highest cost in the subregion of the Caribbean, then comes South America and then Mesoamerica. This allows us to conclude that there's an important amount of people that cannot access to a healthy diet. And this amount of people that cannot access to a healthy diet increased in between 2020 and 2021. So that raises a flag that we need to keep on advancing so that we can make healthy diets accessible to vulnerable areas. So rural areas, areas that have a lower income and others. There are some concepts that are important to highlight when we talk about accessibility of a healthy lifestyle and a healthy diet. And this is mainly poverty levels. This is also considered for the calculation. And it is important to also consider the income inequality. We have seen some important changes, especially in extreme poverty in our region. And this is associated to a lower accessibility to a healthy diet in the context of the pandemic. And we still can see this as a great challenge because as we have seen some changes in relation to the prevalence of hunger and the prevalence of food insecurity, moderate or severe, we have not seen these reductions in terms of the cost. So the cost is something that we need to keep on having as a main focus in public policies. In terms of income, when we see the information of the Guinea index, we are concerned to see that Latin America and the Caribbean present the highest inequality of income. So inequality of income is an indicator that is associated to accessibility to a healthy diet. So on the one part, we have all of the challenge that is associated to the cost, but also we need to consider that the challenge of accessibility is a challenge to avoid leaving people behind and attend the vulnerable populations and also actually reduce inequality and food insecurity. Another important aspect that we need to consider, especially when we talk about the cost of a healthy diet, is related to the cost of the price of food. The price of foods of the FAO, the index of the price of food of the FAO showed an increase when the war in Ukraine started. And we have seen some trends that are making the prices go down, but we still see that the prices are over the ones that we had previous to the pandemic. So this is something that we need to keep on exploring. And also we need to say that inflation, especially the general inflation compared to food inflation, is a relevant aspect to consider because inflation of prices in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have seen that is over the general one, and it has been increasing. We have seen changes in the index of prices in terms of food in a in the global aspect, but this is not necessarily related to the prices that consumers pay locally. So those concepts are also relevant indicators that we need to analyze to be able to gather this information and to apply these methodologies. But also we need to keep on elaborating and keep on redesigning and reassessing public policies and the solutions that are being addressed to be able to reduce the cost of a healthy diet in all of the agro-food system and also increasing the accessibility. So now to finish, because I think that I don't have much more time, I wanted to say something that was already mentioned. The projection that we see, the projection that we saw in 2022 talked about as a number of public policies to be able to increase the accessibility of to a healthy diet, and that made it very important to also include an approach, agroalimentary approach that went to see the different elements, processes, and players of this agro-food system, focusing on the supply chain and the quality of the food, but also in the environments, in the food environments, but also getting to people. So implementing policies that were addressing the different producers, the trade and the market of the products, and also policies that were addressing the consumers. So to summarize, we can get to know more about this in the report, but it's important to say that first of all, we need to promote the reduction of prices in the foods that are nutritious. This is something that is important to talk about. We need to see what is going on with the prices of this kind of food in all of the agro-food system. And it also it is important to address the limitation of the access for populations, for different populations to get to foods that are more nutrition in a physical or in a monetary way. So one of the ways to address this is through the markets and the agroalimentary agro-food trade. So we also need to keep on having a resilient production and sustainable production, but also fostering the consumption of these types of foods, giving support to the more vulnerable areas. So, for example, protection measures that are sensitive to food systems and school feeding system. In the report, we analyze this in more detail in terms of what are these experiences or these policies that already exist in the region and that in a way have been addressing these elements to produce certain changes and increase accessibility or food or monetary access to food. And one program that I can highlight is the program of family agriculture. This is focused to production and also to the food programs and the local markets, the foster of different crops, for example, ancestral foods that have an important nutritional value for the promotion not only to the generation of income for the more vulnerable communities, but also the contribution to them, the platforms for following up the prices of the different foods. And this is at a national level and for statistics, but also through the markets and the other types of places where people go to get their food. So monitoring the different households to improve their accessibility and other measures that are complementary to improve the nutrition and to improve the health of the different populations. For example, the labeling of the products. So in this sense, I just wanted to say that we are very grateful to be able to share all of this information with you, and especially knowing more about what you are going to be presenting to keep on building together these public policies and this everything that we're doing to improve the situation of nutrition through working on the cost and accessibility to nutrition food.
De la necesidad urgente de apoyar a los países.
Thank you, Daniela. Clearly, there is an urgent need to support the countries to implement the roadmaps for the transformation of agri-food systems that allow for access to healthy diets of the population of Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, from Tufts University, our colleague, Professor William Masters, will be presenting on the world context regarding the cost and accessibility to healthy diets for Latin America and the Caribbean. Professor William, you have 15 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much to everyone who's joining and to the FAO team for organizing this meeting, especially to Daniela Godoy and that introduction about the work in Latin America, which so many of you on the call know much better than me. So to begin, can you hear me okay?
Yes. Go ahead.
I think you may not be able to hear me. Let me try this. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, we can hear
Yes,
you.
loud and clear. Yes.
Excellent. So I will continue with this agenda to explain the global context for the cost and affordability of healthy diets. All of you know your own countries and your own region so much better than I do. I'm going simply to explain where some of these methods come from. I know that in the group here, we have Anna Herforth, who contributed very much to this, and the many others that you'll see in the slides that I'll share. So Esperanza, you can advance to the next slide. So the work that you all are doing in the LAC region is a part of this global shift towards thinking about access to healthy diets as a new way of measuring global food security. So in that first bullet, you see that for decades, food security was defined and measured as just calories for survival. This dates from the 1960s when the FAO first built those food balance sheets that enabled the FAO and continue today to enable the FAO to measure this prevalence of undernourishment, the number of hungry people. That's based on total food consumption relative to energy requirements. And what's most important, I think, for us today is that problem of obesity and diet-related diseases at the same time as billions of people lack basic food security in the sense of access to desired foods. That's what the FAO has measured as the experience of food insecurity. And Esperanza, you can go back one to the previous bullet. So the FAO defines experience of food insecurity as the number of people who go to bed hungry or skip a meal or eat less than they wanted to or eat other foods than their usual diet due to a lack of resources to buy their usual foods. And this new agenda that we'll talk about today in this extraordinary workshop is how to use data on retail prices to track the cost and affordability of a healthy diet, not just what people usually eat, which is often unhealthy, but to track what your own dietary guidelines, the national governments in Latin America and around the world have defined as a healthy diet. So since 2016, my collaborators around the world in governments, in international organizations, including some people on this call, have had a set of projects to develop these new metrics in collaboration with the FAO, primarily for the SOFI report, but also for operational purposes to measure food and nutrition security in the sense of access to foods that meet international criteria for a healthy diet. And by access, we mean, can people actually acquire, obtain, or often buy from a market? And our goal is to guide intervention by matching items that are available in the food environment to people's health needs so we can distinguish between causes of unhealthy diets. So if, as is the case in many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, if the problem is high prices, you have unusually expensive healthy diets, then the region needs to invest in production of those healthy foods and distribution to the people in need so that the cost is lower. And by cost, I mean the actual cost of production, not a subsidized price, but the price to everyone. If, however, the problem is low incomes, because diet costs are similar to elsewhere, but incomes are too low, then clearly you need social protection. There needs to be higher earnings, higher wages and employment, or social assistance, a safety net program. And it is also possible, so if you advance one more, Esperanza, the third possible cause of poor diets would be to have a unhealthy foods instead of the healthy diet that is accessible, and that in other words, there's displacement of healthy by unhealthy foods, which would cause poor diets. So the overall work that we're doing here began with pilot studies in Africa, in Ghana and Tanzania, but has now been extended worldwide by the FAO through this SOFI report, annually just released this month in July, and the kind of regional project that you're seeing here. So the next slide gives us an understanding from United States data, but it would be similar for most countries in the world, of just how much of the value added of a country's food price that consumers must pay is not the farm gate ingredient, which is in green at the bottom of this chart. That's only about 10% of the total cost for the consumer. All of the rest, 90% of the cost to consumer, is the value added after the farm, which, as you can see, includes the food processing and packaging, and as well as the retail services above that. And if you advance the slide, you'll see that this is even more pronounced, even more extreme for food away from home, where the ingredients in green at the bottom, the farm products, are less than 5% of the cost of food away from home. Most of it is that retail services. Now, the data we're looking at now come from the United States, and the FAO has pioneered some suggestive evidence in low and middle income countries. And we know that farm prices are a little bit larger share of the consumer dollar in most of your food environments, but not very much more. Probably around 20%, maybe as much as 25%, but typically not the majority of the price paid by consumers. Most of the price paid by consumers is retail services, like you're seeing here, after the farm gate harvest, to transport and store and distribute and provide the retail facilities that people buy. So with the next slide, you can see how this creates very different patterns of food crises, with the next slide, of food price variation. So at the bottom of this chart, you see the green line for the wholesale producer price of unprocessed foods. And notice how that average price, again, this is the United States, but you would have similar results in other countries, has these short spikes, brief periods when the price is very high. That's a food crisis, when suddenly people have to pay much more, but that's for the raw, unprocessed food. In the light blue line, you see the wholesale price to the food factory, if you will, the food company making the product, such as bread or tortillas or canned tinned beans or other kinds of tinned fish and any kind of product like that. Those processed foods, you see that their variation reflects the spikes in the green line, but much less variation. And then the grocery prices for retail food at home is the blue line, with some spikes, but much less. And the orange line at the top is restaurant prices. And that would be true for any kind of food away from home. All of the street food reflects mainly wages and rents. And if you advance one more, you see how the prices in the United States have risen quite sharply, because you may know that the United States has a very strong labor market now, with wages for low-income people rising relatively quickly after the pandemic. And so our restaurant prices have grown quite a bit. Grocery prices fluctuate around overall inflation with the cost of the facilities and the energy, whereas food away from home has a larger share of wages paid to workers. And the next slide shows how commodities link to retail items in markets all around the world. So here you're looking at a project we did with the Trade and Markets Division of the FAO in Rome, where we were looking globally at a total of almost 700 foods in 144 countries. And you can see in the first column how retail food items, most of them, 55% on average for all countries and all foods, but at the top you see 72% of the starchy staples category. Those can be matched to an actively imported primary ingredient. So, for example, in many countries, you would have bread or tortillas, and then you would have wheat or maize, and that primary ingredient would be imported. But if you look in the second column, you see that the percent of the retail price, that is the cost of that actively imported primary ingredient, averages a quarter, 26% in the case of animal source foods, or much less down to 10% for starchy staples like bread, where the cost of wheat would be only on average something like 10% of the cost of bread. So you can see that when we look at retail prices, we're looking at a cost of food which is not just agriculture. It's something else. It's this added value off the farm, which is the infrastructure for transportation, all of the marketing activities for storage, and often cold storage, which is energy intensive and crucial to do that in a climate smart manner. And then all of the retailing, the facilities, and the labor for distribution to consumers. So the next slide shows you how we have dealt with these prices, these retail prices, to map them to the cost of healthy diets. So as I mentioned, for decades since the 1960s, people have focused on that first step of the ladder, the daily energy. And what we have done since then is to have the nutrient adequacy in blue and then the cost of healthy diets, which is what we focus on now. And if you advance one more to the next image, you see how in 2018, and then a series of papers after that, we were able to understand how retail prices affect the cost of the whole diet and create, with Anna Herforth's use of all of the food-based dietary guidelines that are published by national governments around the world, to create that healthy diet basket, which is now the cost standard for the cost and affordability data that Daniela Godoy just presented in your region. So the next slide, if you advance, advancing will show you how the foods that are included typically differ by country. So on the left, you have Senegal, then Pakistan, and then one more, you see Italy. Notice how the items that are chosen in each food group are different. In Italy, they're packaged processed foods often. In Senegal or Pakistan, they're basic unprocessed foods. And you can see the types of items that are included. And the next slide, please, will show you how the cost level in every country, and you know that Latin America and the Caribbean is roughly in the middle of this range, this income range, and has the relatively high green points there for the cost of a healthy diet. There's no lower cost. If you advance one more, costs are not lower in low-income countries. And these averages are, as Daniela Godoy just explained. And you can advance one more to see how this has changed since 2000, since 2020, as Daniela Godoy just explained. And advance one more. And we get to the comparison with actual food expenditure. And Esperanza, you can advance again to see how the low-income countries have actual food spending, which is much less than it would cost to have a healthy diet. And advancing one more, you see that middle and high-income countries, people often spend much more, but as we know, they don't often get the components of that healthy diet whose cost is lower than what people actually spend, but the cost of meal preparation or the cultural aspirations influenced by advertising and marketing lead to the higher expenditure, even when the diet is of lower quality than that green square, which costs less than people actually spend and would be healthier, but is not chosen for some reason in those middle and high income countries for many, many people. And advance one more, and it's important to say that what we're looking at here are the national averages. And of course, every country has enormous inequality, and we must pay careful attention to every group to think about disparities and inequities within the countries. And the next slide compares our cost and affordability metrics, access to nutrition, access to a healthy diet, versus the experience of food insecurity, which is in the red stars. And what you notice is that in the low-income countries, the red stars are well below the green squares. And that tells you that there is much less experience of food insecurity in those countries than there is unaffordability. People do not experience food insecurity because they're eating an unhealthy diet, just a lot of starchy staples, vegetable oil, some sweets, but they could not afford a healthy diet. Meanwhile, on the right side of this chart, you see that the red stars are well above the green circles, indicating that there is experience of food insecurity among many people who could afford a healthy diet, but they nonetheless experience food insecurity because their usual diet is much more expensive than this minimal cost healthy diet. For reasons of convenience and taste and preferences, they want more expensive foods, and they experience food insecurity because they cannot afford those due to lack of money. And that lack of money is primarily loss of employment or illness from non-food expenses that people have when they fall ill. So in conclusion, with the next slide, I think this work that you all are doing is reflecting this global shift, that it's been a real privilege to work with the FAO on building the analytical foundation for policy action, where in the next slide, in advancing one more, you can see how many people in the Latin America, Caribbean region can afford a healthy diet but choose not. And we can identify least cost items and diet costs to guide intervention. Once affordability is assured, maintaining a dietary balance is very difficult. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Really appreciate and look forward to participating in the discussion.
Muchísimas gracias, profesor William. Realmente pone sobre la mesa.
Thank you so much, Professor. You really put on the table the need of advancing on the methodologies that exist to assess the cost of healthy diets and also accessibility and affordability of more nutritional foods, elements like a basic food basket with a nutritional approach, and also connecting with the production and increasing the availability of healthy foods were some of the aspects that Professor William mentioned. Now we are going to move on to the World Food Program from the UN, and they will be sharing a thorough presentation on the cost of the healthy diet food basket and experience through an analysis conducted in Colombia. For that, we have our panel members, Savkia and Carla Mejia, who will be doing the following presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here and to do this presentation together with Carla and Mejia. So what we'll share is findings from the field nutrient gap analysis in Colombia. We've extracted slides from a country presentation in June. This was a presentation where we shared findings for validation. So the analysis is not finalized yet, but we'll give you an impression of the findings and also specifically of the methodology we've used. So on the next slide, I'm showing you how what is this field nutrient gap analysis. It's really to help countries unpack what would be a trajectory to strengthen food systems so that the nutrition situation can be improved through multi-sectoral action. So it's an analytical approach with a strong stakeholder engagement component, where we really bring in stakeholders that are not so familiar with nutrition. Yeah, next one. So we've been doing this analysis since 2017. And here you can see in green all the countries where we have had the opportunity to work with the stakeholders to do this analysis, and in blue the ongoing ones. So for Latin America and the Caribbean, it's been in Guatemala, El Salvador, Ecuador, Dominican Republic, and now Colombia. So there is the cost of the diet component to your right, and then the complementing that with secondary sources of information to understand the food system and to interpret the findings from the cost of the diet and the affordability of the diet. And also to inform modeling. So we do what if scenarios, and I'll show you that in a bit more detail in a few slides later. What we analyze is a diet that meets nutrient needs of different individuals. So we have what we call a modeled household, which allows us to look at specific target groups. And it also gives us a good per capita average. So it includes a child under 2 that's breastfed. There's a school child, an adolescent girl, the woman who's breastfeeding the under 2, and an adult man. So we can look by target group and we can take the average of that. So the data that we use, and this is the way we did it for Colombia, we used the household consumption and expenditure survey price data for the foods. And then we adjusted those prices using the CPI information for 2019, 2020, 21, and 2022. And we used the expenditure information to assess the affordability of the cost that we arrived at. So we use linear programming, a software called Cost of the Diet, and that will select a combination of foods that meets those nutrient needs of those different members of that household. So you get a cost benchmark. The next one. So basically, we now estimate the cost of 3 diets or 3 baskets. One is a diet that just meets energy needs. Then we have the diet that I just explained, which is nutrient adequate across a life cycle, so for 5 different individuals. And then we also estimate the healthy diet cost, where we use the methodology that Anna and Will developed, and that's used in the SOFI report. Now, because we do the analysis for and with country stakeholders, we can of course adapt. The healthy diet is the diet for following food-based dietary guidelines. So we can use the global methodology, or we can use country-specific if the country has such. And in fact, Colombia has it, and Colombia has it for different individuals also. So not only for a reference individual. Now that made the calculations we can all do, but the communication of that became a bit complex, and especially with stakeholders who are not so familiar with all of this. So what we really wanted to emphasize was just meeting energy and food needs is one cost, and then because we want the diet to meet nutritional needs and to be adequately diverse for good health, that cost is higher. So let's then look at what is that cost, how affordable is it, and what can be done about it. So we're not emphasizing differences, but we're really saying, meeting dietary needs for health and nutrition and development and human capital cost you considerably more than just meeting energy needs. Next one. So for this audience, just to explain, we really have these 2 metrics as complementary. With the nutritious diet calculated using linear programming. So you get a selection of foods that doesn't necessarily make good meals across the day, but it allows you to also bring in fortification, supplementation, and to zoom in on specific target groups and understand the extent to which their nutrient needs can be met. The healthy diet is not really optimized for cost. Of course, within each food group, we select the lower costing items, and it's typically done for an indicator individual. So they are complementary approaches. And on the next slide, I explain a little bit more about the modeling. So our what-if scenarios. So by focusing on the extent to which nutritional needs can be met, you can look at the trajectory. So you're coming from a situation where the diet is not adequately diverse and not affordable for everyone. And how can you incrementally improve that diet? and ensuring that the nutrient needs are met while diversity improves. So we look at modeling across different buckets, modifying, improving production and therefore lowering prices, fortification to increase nutritional value, income supporting interventions, whether it's cash transfers, livelihood interventions, etc., and also interventions for specific target groups. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Carla to share some of the findings from Colombia.
Thank you so much, Saskia. Mil gracias, Saskia, y a los colegas. Como
Thank you very
mencionabas,
much, Saskia. And as you said, this is an analysis that was done with the Colombian government to understand what were the costs of a diet in terms of energy and nutrition as well.
estos son costos que más o menos.
So these are costs that in December 2022, as you can see, it was a cost of only for energy. It was between 5,000 to 15,000 Colombian pesos, so $1.3 more or less to $3 more or less. So this is the distribution, and it allows us to know that the cost of a diet, just in terms of energy, is much higher in certain regions and sub-regions of the country. So, for example, regions as Mitu or Puerto Carreño, which are geographically remote. But what is of concern is that regions such as Medellin, with a high density, also shows that there is a high cost of a diet just in terms of energy.
Asimismo, si vemos esta misma tendencia se ve más o menos en el caso de una dieta.
We can see the same trend in the case of a diet that is nutritious. So the cost is between 13,000 and 33,000 Colombian pesos. And you can also see a big difference in the different areas in Colombia, in the south, for example. So we can see that the cost is going to vary a lot.
Lo interesante que vemos aquí es
what is interesting to see here is that there are similar patterns in the nutritious diet and the healthy diet.
Los costos de la dieta, tanto
the cost of the nutritious diet and healthy diet varies.
Tiene un costo un poco más asequible que la región fronteriza norte.
So the blue one is a little bit more accessible.
Nosotros también a través de este modelo podemos ver
through this model, we can also see that there are certain foods that have a bigger density of micronutrients, and that could mean that they have a higher cost in Colombia. So, for example, in the case of milk, the cost
constituyen el 41%
makes up for 33% versus just an 80% and 80% of the cost in calories. On the other hand, the cost of a group of cereals is just a 33% of the basket, while this represents a 48% of the calories of this basket. So that makes us suggest that a person that has a low income could have a trend to use this equation to consume foods that are based on cereals beyond calories or foods that have calories from other elements. We can also see that the increase in income can mean that there's more diversity of diet. So a diet that can have an increase in animal-based products. It was also very interesting to see a temporal situation here between 2021 and 2022 to understand the effects of the pandemics and the effects of the latest crisis, mainly the inflation that affected foods. And as we can see from 2021 to 2022, the nutritious diet increasing more than a 30% in its cost. So that means that inflation and the post-pandemic effect, besides the effect of the war in Ukraine, were two important aspects in the increase of the cost of the diet. So the nutritious diet became even less accessible.
Esto fue súper importante para los
This was very important for the allies that we had in the government. There are patterns that are very similar in food insecurity and accessibility in the Colombian case. As we can see in these two maps, the levels of food insecurity show us that we see places where the accessibility is very low. So as I said before, this helped us to talk with counterparts in the government in terms of how we can model interventions that are still used to optimize the situation. So this intervention is a real intervention in the Colombian government that has three types of baskets, three types of systems where they can supply a supplement for children that are more vulnerable. So we modeled this accessibility to diet to understand what was going on with the people that had access to these baskets. And as we saw, the baskets of the first childhood attention covers the most part of the cost of the nutritious diet. So when we disaggregated the data with the people that were receiving the supplements, we saw that this contributed in the biggest proportion in terms of the reduction of the cost. So in our case, the use of this model that we talked about with Saskia allows us to have interventions or to draw real conclusions in this type of interventions from the government. So we would like to continue with this type of interventions for the more vulnerable families. We also see in PNA that social assistance has a catalyzing role in the prevention of malnutrition. We help, or they help vulnerable families, but it also helps other families and that areas in general. So that talks about the reduction of barriers, and also it supports the use of services of health and nutrition and other services that are essential. So we started discussing with different government players to see what kind of interventions we could integrate in a better way through different assistance. And for example, assuming that a 60% of a transference is used in food, this also was something that we had mapped from other evidence. So we saw that the transit to citizen rent would cover, depending on the region, a 17 and up to a 50% of a nutritious diet. So it is very important for us, for the government, to get this recommendation for the people that are highly vulnerable, mainly. And also especially in regions such as the ones that we see here in Mocoa, in Tice, and the center south of Colombia, and also in El Llano, Puerto Carreño, and San Jose. And also in border places, Rio Hacha or Monteria in the Caribbean, it is important to have this type of integration there to integrate nutrition intervention to the systems for social protection. And well, we trust that the validation of these results that we're still working on with our counterpart of the government, and we were doing this with workshops, with the joint elaboration of the database, that this helps as a base to give recommendations for the government and for other government agencies so that we can actually have intervention that are related to nutrition and that will allow us to have solutions in the short and medium term to reduce this crisis or to fight this crisis. And the next step would be the implementation, the joint work that this is what we're working on with the Colombian government. And we will continue with these recommendations accordingly. Thank you very much. And with that, I will give the floor to Israel. Thank you very much, Carla and Saskia, for this great presentation. We can see the recommendation to optimize food systems, where we can consider other aspects, for example, the cost and the aspects of sustainability. So it is really a very helpful program. So now we will hear Dr. Michelle Unar Unquia, who will talk about the methodology for defining the cost of a healthy diet from the experience of the National Institute of Health in Mexico. Go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you so much for the invitation to present today on this methodology. I am now sharing my screen. Please confirm that you're able to see my screen. Yes. Go on. Okay, I will share with you the case of Mexico in terms of how we were able to estimate the cost of a healthy diet and also a sustainable diet. In the case of the definition of a healthy and sustainable diet, it would be the patterns of a diet that promote all the dimensions of health and well-being of individuals, not only with low environmental impact and pressure, but also affordable, accessible, safe, equitable, and culturally suitable, and also that contribute to all forms of malnutrition, both due to surplus as well as deficiency, and also help preserving biodiversity and the health of the planet. A couple of years ago, the Eat Lancet Commission recommended a reference healthy diet that I will be calling Eat Healthy Reference Diet, which is a sustainable diet that also guarantees the human and planet health. And these type of diets also include a diversity of different foods, especially of vegetable sources, and also low amounts of animal foods. They contain non-saturated fats instead of saturated fats, and they limit the added sugars and refined flours, ultra-processed foods, while at the same time they try to prevent the waste of food. They prioritize agricultural techniques that are available to benefit the health of the planet and also promote local markets. At the world level, as it has been mentioned already, the cost and affordability are key for sustainable healthy diets. The cost can be a limiting factor, particularly for lower income populations to access healthy diets, and almost 40% of the population in the world, well, this is data that changed recently with the new information that has been presented. However, it is said that 40% of the people are unable to afford a healthy diet, and overall healthier diets are more expensive, but it varies, of course, depending on the level of income of the country. For instance, a study conducted in 150 countries found that healthy and sustainable diets were 22 to 34% less expensive in mid, high, and high income countries, whereas these healthy, sustainable diets are more expensive in countries of mid, low, and low income countries. In Mexico, a study that was published by Dr. or PhD Carolina Batis from the Institute of Public Health modeled different diets using a modeling tool which is called diet diet cost tool with which they were able to model with the different prices using the available costs from the National Institute or Department of Statistics that are used to estimate the consumer prices and follow up on inflation. And they use the 24-hour reminder of Ensanut 2012, and for the different or for the Mexican guidelines we had in 2015, because now we will be presenting information that is updated to the new food guidelines. And she also modeled the Eat Health diet adapted to the Mexican context, and they found that the cost was 29% lower in comparison to current food baskets, considering that the two diets were isocaloric, and the difference would be of 40% lower in terms of cost if the comparison were different. So in the latest years, in the last 3 years actually, a work was conducted to draft the new sustainable healthy diet guidelines for Mexican population. They were published this year, and the new guidelines for the first time include mentions to sustainability, including lower environmental impact, and also the fact that they are affordable, culturally relevant, and that they promote the health and well-being of people. So the food guidelines start from the definition of a sustainable and healthy diet adapted to the Mexican context with an intersectorial multidisciplinary group of people that reached the consensus of each of the recommendations that are issued in terms of food groups for the guidelines and physical activity that is included. I will not address the guideline in depth. I would like to mention that they promote that more fruits and vegetables are consumed, more legumes as well, and that ultra-processed foods are avoided, and that the consumption of red meat is decreased, as well as sausages and sugary beverages to promote just plain water, just as an overview of what the guidelines say. So what we did was to analyze the environmental impact and the cost of healthy sustainable diets, both based on the 2023 guidelines, as well as of the healthy reference diet adapted to the Mexican context in comparison to the ongoing intake by the Mexican population in terms of adults. What I will be presenting today is based on the information of adult population. I will not address the environmental impact. I will only talk about the cost and affordability because that is the approach of this workshop. Now, in terms of indicators and sources of information, what we did was to use the recommendations of amounts of intake from the 2023 food guidelines that I forgot to mention, that the amounts that are suggested for the different foods cover most of the micronutrients and also macronutrients and the energy needed in order to fully function in each age range and sex for you or for people to lead a healthy life. And the same goes for the Eat Lancet diet adapted to the Mexican context. And for the average diet for adults, we use the information and the 24-hour reminder of the report of Sanut 2016, which is a nutrition survey conducted nationally, and we analyzed information of over 1,400 individuals over 18 years old, representative sample at the national level, and also representative per region, per urban, rural area, and per state. That data was linked with prices of the foods reported by our National Statistics and Geography Department, INEGI, and it gave us the average price for 2020, 21, and 22 as reported in 46 cities of the country. For those foods with prices that were reported for more than one brand, we used the average of the price per kilogram or liter. Now, what was the methodology? Well, the first thing we did was that the amount of foods reported per individual at the Ensanut survey was converted net into the gross equivalent using how the food is purchased, using a table that is compiled by the Institute. Then we linked the prices of each food reported individually at the Ensanut with the average prices from INEGI, and at the end we were able to link 77.4% of the food codes that account for 542 different foods and the 158 foods that represented under 4% of the overall intake of energy per person were actually spices that we were unable to link to their prices and or that were not part of the food guidelines. However, they do not represent a significant amount of the intake of energy per person. Then, what did we do to model the consumption of a healthy, sustainable diet with the recommendations that I mentioned earlier, the food guidelines, as well as the Eat Healthy reference diet? What we did here was to consider the suggested amount of all 16 food groups in order to decide which foods were going to be uh, taken from each group of foods and in what amount. What we did was to add up the percentage of consumption in grams of each of the foods within the food groups as reported in the Ensanut survey to assume that the population had the same distribution. And I have some examples here. Let's say grains and cereals are comprised by tortillas, rice, bread, pasta, potatoes. So in the Ensanut, we saw what percentage was allocated to tortilla within the consumption of grains and cereals. So I don't have all the percentages in detail, but it was close to, say, 70%. So what we did was to consider the amount that the food guidelines suggest for grains and cereals, and we multiplied that by the rate that tortillas is consumed to calculate the consumption of each of the foods per group of foods. So we did the same for vegetables, fruits, dairy products, beef, and others. And in order to estimate the cost of the diets, what we did was to multiply the price of each of the foods times the consumption that we estimated previously of each food, and we added that in order to estimate the cost of the diet, whether the current diet and the one that we modeled as a sustainable healthy diet based on the recommendations, and we estimated the average of the cost of the diets in order to compare. Now I will be moving on to the results. In average, this is the average of the cost of the current diet, and that would be the light green. That would be based on the Insanut 2016 survey, and I am also showing the cost for 2021 and 22. For 2022, the cost of the current diet would be of $3.58, and the cost of a diet that follows the recommendations of the food guidelines of 2023 would decrease in approximately 25% in comparison to the current diet, while the cost of a diet that would follow the recommendations of the Eat Healthy reference diet for Mexican population would be more or less 29% lower in comparison to the current diet. This is more or less $2.69 for the diet that follows the food guidelines and $2.55 for the cost of the healthy reference diet. Now, if we were to compare all of this with the food poverty lines, which is the cost of the urban or rural basket as estimated by the institute responsible for the poverty estimations in the country, we see this institute is Coneval. We see that both the cost of a diet that follows the guidelines as well as the cost of a diet like the Eat Healthy Reference Diet are lower than the cost of the urban food basket, and it is closer to the cost of the rural food basket. Therefore, we would say that it is more affordable for the population than what they are really spending in their food on a daily basis. Here we see data regarding the daily cost of the diets divided in rural and urban areas. And we see that in 2020 to 2022, the cost of the diets increased in urban and rural areas, but the increase was larger in urban areas. We see that the current diet went from 63 pesos to almost 76 pesos in 2022. And even though the cost of the healthy diet also increased, the increase was much lower and the cost of a healthy diet is lower in comparison to the current diet in urban areas. And also we are able to see that the healthy and sustainable diets are less expensive in rural areas, but the gap in comparison to the current diet is less than in the urban areas. Now, if we were to break this per food groups, we see the cost per person per day for the 16 food groups, and we see that for healthy, sustainable diets based on the guidelines and also based on the Eat Healthy Reference Diet, as the recommendation is to increase the consumption of vegetable foods, what we expected to see was an increase in the cost in these foods, for instance, vegetables, fruits, in comparison to the current price that the population pays, and also a decrease in terms of the price of animal foods like beef that we see that it decreased from 6.9 pesos that people spend in average on a daily basis. If they were to follow the guidelines, they would spend 2.8 pesos, or the healthy reference diet that has even a lower recommendation of beef consumption, and that would lead to 1 peso, close to 1 peso a day. But something else that's very important in this analysis per food group is that ultra processed foods, industrialized foods, sugary beverages, and cereals with sugar and fat that are not recommended to the population because they increase the risk of malnutrition, overweight, and obesity and other chronic illnesses. These groups of foods of the total cost of the diets of people, they account for 38.7% of the cost. Whereas if we were to follow a sustainable, healthy diet where the consumption of these foods is not recommended, the cost of the foods would decrease by not consuming them, which then would allow us to increase the consumption of other foods like vegetables, nuts, and fruits. Now, there are certain limitations and strengthens to the methodology. For instance, the 24-hour reminder is a single day study, which could not reflect the current diet of a person. But since we're working based on averages, the average of consumption of all the population does reflect the average consumption, and it allows us to compare and the prices of foods are based on the prices of in 46 cities, mainly urban areas, and we're not following the prices in rural areas. However, we have conducted a sensitivity analysis using other sources of information like the national surveys on income and expenses of the households, where we were able to obtain the income for rural and urban areas, and we were able to draw similar conclusions to the ones presented already. And also by using data from the National Survey of Health, which is a nationally representative survey that allows us to include those foods that are more consumed by the population and to model sustainable and healthy diets, considering these foods that are consumed the most, that are culturally relevant, and that are available. So in conclusion, we see that diets that are based on the recommendations like the guidelines and also the reference diets have a lower cost in comparison to the current diet in Mexico, and the decrease in the costs is due to increasing the consumption of vegetable foods and decreasing the consumption of red meats and ultra processed foods as well as sugary beverages. These agrees with the findings internationally in other studies that have been conducted that show great variability in the cost of healthy diets depending on the level of income of the countries. And as I showed, it is similar to another study in Mexico that used a different tool, which is the diet cost. With that, I'd like to leave the contact information and thank you. Thank you, Mitel. We can really see a number of elements to get to the cost of a healthy diet. Among those, we can mention the food guidelines based on the food systems, the food basket with a nutritional approach, and also food and sustainability that you mentioned in your presentation. Moving along, we have Professor Gabriela Guajardo with the topic methodology for the definition of the cost of a healthy diet, the basic food basket with a nutritional approach from the School of Nutrition of the University of the Republic Uruguay. Gabriela, the floor is yours.
Gabriela, no te escuchamos, tienes el audio cerrado.
Gabriela, we cannot hear you.
Bien, así
Hello,
te
everyone. I don't know if you can see me well here. Yes, I can see your screen. Well, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to tell you that for me, it's a real honor to be here with you. And in this sense, I would also like to thank Gabriela and Israel for the great initiative that they have had in organizing this event and the space that you have given to this important aspect in Latin America and the Caribbean. And also thank the national coordinator in the Observatory of the Right of Food in Uruguay, Alejandra Quiroga, for having selected us to present today.
compartir con ustedes hoy lo que ha sido la
So I
experiencia.
wanted to share with you about the experience that we have developed in the construction of a basic basket based on nutrition. So in our School of Nutrition,
Desde hace muchos
there's
años
no doubt that for many years we have been including this. For some years, we have been including this in the people that are going to take the program in nutrition in our university. And we have been focusing on this aspect in the nutrition programs because when we talk about a basic basket that has nutrition in its center, we are talking about this basic human right, which is being well fed. So we said in the year 2020, okay, let's go to the next step, that this is not just a theory, but really let's build for the country the basic basket based on nutrition And
Hacemos un monitoreo de
let's also do a monitoring of what happens with this basket. So let's put this information available for everyone and for the decision makers so that, as Lynette said, they can make the decisions that are necessary. Because let's not forget that with the basic food, with basic basket food, the countries know what has to be available for their population, or they need to identify those aspects that need to be accessible in terms of prices for their population.
nutricional, también
Also, counseling and nutrition. This is basic to access. The access is something that we have been talking about a lot, setting the prices based on the minimum income, and also knowing and estimating the proportion of people that are in vulnerable situation that have food insecurity as well. So in these lines, inspired in the methodology that was proposed by the INTA, we started with this process. And as a first step for establishing this basket, we talked about the determination of the energy input that this basket is going to satisfy. We were oriented in terms of the recommendations for energy and nutrients that the ministry in Uruguay sets. So we took that as a reference, the energetic input that is needed by any person that is of a certain age range to establish the amount of iron and calcium. So we took the energetic intake that was proposed, but considering that they established for different groups of gender and age, we calculated the what was needed from the for this age range. And also the other thing that we considered was the sodium. And once we established this input, we went to the next step, which was the selection of foods. So what criterion we used for this? What you have mentioned many times, which is the food, the understanding what are the groups that the guidelines establish, but also the orientations that were mentioned in terms of the fact that we in Uruguay opt to include natural foods or minimally processed foods. So we identified what are the group of foods, but if we talk about basic baskets, we're talking about the right of food. And we're not just talking about quality and quantity from the biological point of view, but also contemplating cultural preferences. So how do we know about cultural preferences in terms of food in our population? Through information that the national survey gives us. And with that, we can estimate the average of consumption. That also allowed us to identify what are the foods that we are going to select for those categories, considering what were the ones that were consumed in a higher proportion. Of course, there are some replacements and additions. And in the case that two types of foods matched or agreed, we needed to see what was the cheapest one. So once we selected the groups of foods, the categories, and the foods in each one of the categories, we went to see the calculation of nutritional input and energetic input. So we started calculating the group of calculating the input of each one of the groups, including the foods that were in this group. So that's how we used the different compositions of these groups. We compared it with the table that we used for this step. So about the calculation of the nutritional input, we established quantities, first of all, for those types of foods. So what we considered for these quantities was, once again, the proportions that the Ministry of Public Health established that each one of the people need to get as a minimum, but also We established different portions, different rations that were related to the consumption that a person needs to have. So it would be illogical to put amounts that no person in Uruguay could consume. Once we added all of these products, we considered that the quantities that, if the quantities were right or not. So with that, we saw that the margin was between a 90 and 110% of the requirement that we had established for energy needs in this basket. So once we did this, we identified the quantities, and then we went to the fourth stage, which is the cost calculation. So as we know, there are certain foods that have parts that are wasted because they're bones or things that are not consumed. So we started focusing on those foods, and we started calculating the gross weight of these foods. So the fruits, the vegetables, etc., to see if the gross weight was useful to calculate the cost. The source of information for the cost is what we got from the National Institute of Statistics. So they report these prices on a monthly basis. We added these averages of the food groups, and then we got a value, a price. So we were inspired in the INTA way of measuring. And we said that we needed to consider a 10% increase because of the waste that is happening in the households. And we also added a percentage that would contemplate the purchase of foods that are related to our food traditions. So for example, some seasonings, and as you know, we consume mate a lot. So that is also included in our basic basket. So once we have all of these values, we get to the cost of the basic basket with a nutritional approach by person. So for one day, if I want to know about the cost per day, per month, I need to calculate the price per day for the total amount of days in a month. So, and for the household, we are going to multiply this by amount of people in a household. So in this report, we are doing this report monthly, and we are doing it for 3 people in a household. This is what we regularly have in our country. So this is what we have been doing in the university, and also with the other organizations. They have been giving us calculations that are faster. And also in the webpage tanastas.nutrition.uy, we put there the reports where we are going to see what is going on month after month and what is happening with the groups of foods that were included. We have been able to compare our basic basket and compare it with what FAO is reporting. We can see, for example, the latest report in the food security situation in the world. And we are in this part, these are the results, as you can see on the graph. So we are in about a 50% of the cost. We started with a process that we need to keep on studying, and we need to see what is going on in other places. We have to identify in the calculation of these baskets the different characteristics, the different ages and situations of the people. And also continuing with the tradition of our university in our discipline, we increased the work group. So we are working in the observatory and with an interdisciplinary team. We started working as well with the Ministry of Economy. We got financing for our program to keep on deepening in these aspects and enriching this process. And also agreeing with what some of the presenters have said, now we are going to start exploring a new methodology, which is the application of the linear methodology. So if we talk about the linear programming, this is a process of using and maximizing and minimizing other aspects and taking into consideration certain restrictions. What is the objective of our minimization? Our objective is to minimize the cost of the basket. So with this, what we are doing is to consider the big components of the right to food. We are making sure that we have the right amount and the right price, and contemplate also the habits of consumption of the population in Uruguay. But as Michelle in Mexico said, we're also considering aspects that are related to sustainability, because let's not forget that this is not just going to satisfy the needs of the inhabitants today, but also the future generations. So about the restrictions that were considered in the optimization, here we are contemplating everything that is related to the recommendations, not only from the Ministry of Health, but also the requirements on average and also the dietary inputs that are recommended. We still have a clear idea to not include the ultra processed foods, and all of the macronutrient goals are being included. So in terms of the incorporation of the consumption habits in Uruguay, we are still using as a source of information in the survey of high income that was done in 2016 and 2017, and we are just incorporating the foods that are purchased by at least 10% of the population. And about the consumption is also going to have to be higher or equal to the average of the quantity that that person has purchased per day. So we are starting this process. We're going to start this year, and we hope that in the next instance, we're going to be able to talk to you and share with you our results. So we are here to share our information. Thank you. Thank you very much, Gabriela, and thank you everyone and all of our speakers for their great interventions and inputs. Your presentations have broadened our comprehension about the new methodologies for the definition of the cost of a basic basket in Latin America and the Caribbean. I would like to highlight the need of including several inputs for this regional exercise. So, for example, the consumption of foods, the habits, cultural pertainance to the foods that you have been mentioning. Now we have some questions that have been asked through the social media or the YouTube channel. And we are going to start with Daniela Godoy. We have a question for each one of our speakers, no more than 2 minutes for your answers, please. So Daniela, based on the experience shared in this webinar, what is the recommendation to have responses that are proportional to the states and the people in terms of the problem that we're dealing with in Latin America to access to nutritious diet? Thank you very much for the question. First of all, I would like to say that we have seen different experiences that are associated to the measurement, to the way that we measure the information. This is very relevant for the decision-making process. We also need to say that exploring the best practices, policies, and solutions is a fundamental thing to be able to move forward in the feeding system of the population. And also we need to start asking ourselves questions in terms of how we can reduce the cost of a healthy diet and how can we increase accessibility to the more nutritious foods. So in that sense, I would like to say that part of the research that we had for our panorama, for our program of nutrition in the United Nations, including the FAO, and that we published in 2022, we started wondering some things, and we identified that it was relevant to include the agroalimentary food systems and also exploring everything that is related to the value chains and the productions, supply chains of the nutritious foods that are part of a healthy diet. That is the concept that we need to address in the alimentary guidelines that are based on that are for the recommendations that are going to be used for the recommendations of the population, and also the agro food system, including the environments and everything that you have talked about in here. So the conclusions in this sense is how, first of all, we are going to strengthen policies and solutions for the production that is resilient and sustainable for nutritious foods, with an important focus on technical support, access to technology, access to credit, and also producers, small scale producers. It is also relevant how we foster the access, the physical aspect, and the different policies emphasizing on the markets of the foods, the wholesalers, the local sellers, trade, because yes, we have production that is very important, especially in the region. There are imports and things that are important to generate these balances. So in third place, it is also important to see how we can access and how we can help these communities that do not have a way to deal with the fluctuations of price. So it is important to mention that we have some aspects such as nutrition, the World Program of Food mentioned some of these, and we also need to consider the school feeding systems that get to the children. This is an experience that is very important, and we know that we need to talk about the work that we do with the FAO and with RISE, with the cooperation of Brazil FAO as well. And it's important to consider other complementary policies to see how we do this promotion. So the nutritious programs, the orchards, the local orchards, and many others. And I'm going to finish with this because I know that we do not have much time to respond all of the questions. But in some of the publications that we have from FAO and that we can share, we have been mentioning these aspects that are implemented in Latin America and the Caribbean, and many of them have a very robust evidence.
Thank you, Daniela. We take this opportunity to read the 300 attendees through social media and other channels. We are going to take a question for Professor William. Is there a study or report out there regarding what is the group of foods that is being more consumed by the population and that is generating most of the expenses by the families? Professor William, the floor is yours. I think your mic's off.
There's actually a lot of variation across regions and countries in the agricultural and food system ways that our common humanity is fed. Biologically, we're very similar, but ecologically, sociologically, our food systems differ. So you really need that local expertise to answer that very good question. Thank you.
Gracias, profesor William. Tenemos también una pregunta para Saskia.
Thank you for that. We also have a question for Saskia and Carla. In the exercise you conducted in Colombia, did you take into account the price variability along the years? And also, did you take into account the seasons? Because these are elements that also have an impact over the cost of foods in the countries. Saskia and Carla, the floor is yours. Yes, I'll take the question. Israel, thank you for that question. Yes, the short answer is yes, we did take into account price variability from 2020 to the end of 2022, and now we're processing data from 2023. In both cases, we wanted to know what happened pre and post the pandemic and the Ukraine war. And we also wanted to study the effect of the inflation crisis that took place, also due to the other crisis that I mentioned earlier. And we wanted to disaggregate the effects based on prices and linked that to the cost of the diet in the region. So yes, the model does allow for that. Great, thank you. As I said it earlier, we have only chosen one question per each of the panel members. There are so much more questions in our social media, and we are going to be answering those at the end of the webinar in those different rooms. Now, let's go to Michelle. Based on the methodology proposed and developed by the Institute, what would be the minimum data to calculate the cost of a healthy, sustainable diet? For instance, how to use the food guidelines with the food system approach. Michelle, the floor is yours. Thank you for that question. Well, first of all, you do need to have the guidelines on food of each country with the specific amounts that are recommended for each food group. And preferably, you also need to have a survey regarding diet, like the one we have, which is a national nutrition survey that contains data whether per 24-hour reminder or frequency of intake and information regarding that intake. If you don't have that, at least you would need to have a national survey on household expenses that would contain information on the purchasing of foods in the households, also surveys that are representative nationally. And of course, you need to have information regarding prices of foods that usually the countries collect this information through the different institutions that are responsible for measuring inflation. In this case, sometimes one difficulty that we may have with prices is that it could be the case that some foods are considered, say, in the recommendations of the food guidelines and/or healthy diets, and they might not be monitored or followed up in terms of their prices by the different institutions involved in following up on the inflation trends. But in general, they do cover most of the foods. So I would say that those would be the minimum elements required to conduct the estimations of the cost of the diet. Thank you, Michelle. We agree with that contribution. And now one last question for Gabriela Fajardo. What is the importance for the countries of updating and putting in place diet guidelines based on food systems? As in the example of Uruguay, they also include the level of processing, considering the issue of obesity and chronic non-transmissible diseases. Gabriela, what can you tell us about that? Well, without a doubt, it is key because all the elements of the food system are connected, right? Therefore, it's important that when it comes to making decisions in terms of public policies, that is included in all the aspects of the food system, ranging from production, consumers, and also other food landscapes. So I think it's very important to reach a common methodology among the countries that would give us more strength to avoid having different initiatives and nationally and maybe working at the level of the region. Thank you, Gabriela, and thank you to all the panel members for answering those questions. And thank you for your willingness to participate today in this virtual seminar called Exchange of Experiences on Methodologies for the Definition of the Cost of a Healthy Diet in Latin America and the Caribbean. We are going to move on to the following part, and I will give the floor to Daniela Godoy, main official of FAO for food policies, that will give us the closing remarks. Daniela, the floor is yours. Well, thank you so much. I think we have had a good conversation regarding the methodologies and measurements experiences that we have in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a pleasure to see that we have had not only the FAO headquarters and also regional offices for Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as the academia and other international entities, and different stakeholders involved in the agri-food systems that are working on this, because it is key for food security and nutrition. I think that what we have to do now is talk about the challenges, what is ahead of us in the future. And I think that a key part of this is, of course, collecting data for decision making. And it is important. We are working on that. We are making progress already. But it is also very important to be able to determine the policies and the solutions that are evidence-based and that will allow us with this systemic approach to tackle the cost of a healthy diet in the region and also to increase affordability of healthy diets, especially for more vulnerable populations. Therefore, we kindly invite you to keep working together to engage in partnerships and networks that would allow us to move forward. And lastly, I have to thank the team and all the attendees, the panel members. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you to all the attendees. Israel mentioned the number of people joining us today because there's definitely interest, because we know that this is key to improve food security and nutrition in the region. And lastly, I would like to thank the entire team that worked for the realization of this seminar. I will not mention individuals because there is a huge team of the regional initiative #1 of FAO for Latin America and the Caribbean. They all worked very hard. So thank you for that. We are at your service to continue working together. Thank you to the entire team. Thank you to the panel members. Thank you to the translators for their help. And thank you for everything to the unit of audiovisual support. Thank you once again, and we hope to see you soon in another activity. Thank you, everyone, and